I played with orchestra for the first time at 16 at Brevard Music Festival. And then a year after that, made my debut at Lincoln Center, playing a full Tchaikovsky piano concerto with 90-piece orchestra, the Symphony of the New World, and I was 17 years old. The Symphony of the New World was an orchestra that consisted of people of African descent, African Americans. At that time in the 70s, the major orchestras were not hiring people that were African American. No matter how well they played, it was the time. Here was an orchestra that was established that gave 90 musicians this opportunity. And it was a very, very special organization. It showed the world that African Americans, in addition to playing gospel and rhythm and blues and jazz, we could and had a history of playing classical music. Chevalier de St. George from France composed symphonies, concertos. He was a fabulous violinist. Mozart came to meet with him. In this country, Thomas Green Bethune was a slave, but he was a savant. He could play anything on the piano that he heard. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the master of the plantation took him all across the country. He performed at the White House. Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who was an English composer, but that came to the United States and was called the Black Mahler because he wrote symphonies. Mahler was a big influence on him. Margaret Barnes, wonderful African-American female composer whose teacher was Florence Price, another great African-American female composer. William Grant Still, the dean of African-American composers. I love performing classically black. I've gone across the country performing this lecture recital where I not only play the music, but I discuss it with the audience. I share with them the different background of the composer, of the piece itself. Chevalier de St. George would write string concertantes, and in his violin playing or writing, he had the violins performing or playing very high up on the neck of the violin. And in fact, Mozart copied this technique and did the same in one of his pieces. Also, Chevalier St. George was the founder of an opera company that was later to become the Paris Opera. This is a composition he wrote called Adagio in F minor. Leonard Bernstein had a series of concerts called Young People's Concerts. And this one concert on CBS, he had this young African-American pianist perform the Liszt Piano Concerto. When I saw Andre Watts, he looked like me. He was only 17, I think, at the time, and I was about 8 or 9. But here was a young black boy like me, playing with an orchestra in front of hundreds of people, and then I said, yes, this is definitely what I want to do. Some of the highlights of my career, well, the first had to be playing with orchestra the first time when I was 16 in North Carolina. And then shortly after that, making my debut at Lincoln Center with the orchestra. Another highlight is something that most concert pianists would never experience, And that was when I made my debut at the Metropolitan Opera House. George Gershwin wrote the opera Porgy and Bess, as we know. But what a lot of people don't know is that he was forced to make many cuts from his original opera. And one of the first cuts he made, there is a huge piano solo. And it's called the Jasbo Brown Blues. I saw a pianist perform it, and I said, I have to do that. I learned it, and the Met found out that I knew it, and so I was hired to come in and do that part. Another highlight, I would have to say even being a professor now. That's number one. So, who felt number one was a feeling of two, a meter of two? Who felt number one was a feeling of four? How about three? That's correct. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, selection number two. I'm at Essex County College, and I'm assistant professor there and head of the performing arts program. I'm hearing students perform, vocalist, instrumentalist, and when you do a master class, or when I do a master class, I try to give constructive comments and suggestions that everyone can benefit by, even people who are not musicians. Now, I have a question I want to ask you. This is Precious Lord, take my hand. Who's the composer?
I believe it's Dorsey.
Thomas Dorsey.
Yes.
Why did he write this song? His wife was pregnant. He was away doing workshops and performing, and she was about to have a baby. She died. And shortly thereafter, the baby died. And he was with members of his church, and he was beyond grief-stricken. And he started to pray, and he said, Lord, and someone must say, Precious Lord. That's what you call him. Precious Lord. And you see, you can't really sing that song effectively without knowing what this man went through that he gave birth to this song. I'm able to really pass on so much knowledge, and not just as a pianist, but as a musician, as an artist, and not just at my own college. One of the things that I do now is I tell my students I'm passing on to them all the wonderful knowledge and information and love of music that these people passed on to me. It's all right to be emotional. It's all right to love music. And it's all right to show your love for what you're doing. The great highlight of my life and career is sharing all this.